Good day.
Today is Friday, 19th September 2025. I am in Chicago in my room, my very comfortable room, and tomorrow I will be returning to Britain, though I expect that I will still have time to do one further program in the United States, in Chicago, before I leave. I will provide a full account and discussion of my actually wonderful time here in Chicago, of the various people that I met here in this extraordinary, wonderful city when I return to Britain. In the meantime, this is again going to have to be a shorter video than usual, and in light of that, I propose to go straight in. Now, it seems to me that the big news continues to be the news on the military battlefronts in Ukraine. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has now quietly confirmed that the number of Russian troops active in the area of special military operation has increased to 700,000. I have no doubt that by now the Russians significantly outnumber the Ukrainians on every part of the battlefront, and as we will see later in the program, the effect of that is telling. It is having a serious impact on the way in which the battle continues. A fact that we are looking at a slow burn military crisis for the Ukrainian military, the focus of which is Pokrovsk, is shown by the latest actions of the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky. After speaking to Ukrainian MPs in Kiev, MPs from his own party, as I discussed in my program yesterday, and telling them that if the situation deteriorates, the military situation deteriorates, critical decisions might have to be made. Anyway, shortly after making that statement and after making more demands for more funding from the West, he's rushed to the area around Pokrovsk. He's met the military commanders there. He's trying to, no doubt, get a sense of the overall military situation. And as Zelensky always does, I have no doubt that he's impressing upon all of the military leaders in this area that they must stand fast, that they must not retreat, that they must not give up ground. This has been Zelensky's major contribution to the war. It has been to essentially deprive the Ukrainian military of any ability to conduct any essential maneuvers. I accept that a country conducting a defensive war might not have a great deal of scope to do the kind of defensive maneuvers involving tactical retreats and those kind of things that a country, an army on the offensive has. But nonetheless, it seems to me that few can doubt that in Zelensky's case, he has taken this stand and fight approach to an extreme level. Well, over the last 24 hours, it's been fascinating to watch as the various mapping projects, Russian, Western, and increasingly, I think, Ukrainian as well, are starting to come round to acknowledging the actual reality of the Battle of Pokrovsk, as previously reported roughly a week ago by Redovka, the newspaper that is published in Smolensk, the one which, as I have said repeatedly, is well ahead in its discussions and its descriptions of the battles around Pokrovsk, and which has been consistently right and in advance of everyone else. Well, a week ago, Radovka was saying that the entire western area of Pokrovsk has collapsed, that the Russians have effective control over south and western Pokrovsk. At the time when Radovka was saying that, no other mapping or reporting project that I'm aware of was saying this. They were instead focusing on the battles that continue to take place northeast of Pokrovsk, in the area of the Russian breakthrough, in the area around Zaloty Kolodyas and Kurechny Yar, and villages like Vladimirivka and those sort of places. And the actual situation within the city of Pokrovsk was a very neglected story. Now, over the last 24 hours, as video footage has started to appear, as more reports about the situation within Pokrovsk have started to trickle out, it's become clear that Radovka's claim that the Russians control, if not the entirety of western Pokrovsk, at least a significant part of it, that is now finally being acknowledged. And we're getting reports now, including from various mapping projects, that the Russians control all of western Pokrovsk, south of the railway line that bisects Pokrovsk, that the Russians are preparing to launch an attack on an area of industrial buildings north of the railway line, that if the Russians do capture this area of the industrial buildings there, the factories and the workshops, then that will mean that Pokrovsk is indeed in a cauldron. The Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk will indeed be in a cauldron or something very close to this. And there are also reports that the Russians have restarted their attacks further east in the center of Pokrovsk towards the railway station in the very center of Pokrovsk. This is likely to be a heavily fortified position. Railway stations are big, complex structures. In theory, fortresses that are easy to defend, but we will see how intense the fighting for this particular building, this structure, becomes. And Radovka has also been claiming that in northeastern Pokrovsk, the situation where the Ukrainians have been conducting counterattacks is a situation of Ukrainian failure, that the various Ukrainian counterattacks have been consistently unsuccessful, that they've not been able to recover lost ground or to break the Russian positions or to roll back the Russian advances in August. In fact, Radovka, in his most recent report, has again repeated a claim that they made previously, that the only effect of the counterattack has been to leave Ukrainian units or parts of Ukrainian units trapped behind Russian lines in various positions, in places like Zaloty Kolodyas, in Volodymyrovka, in other places, that it is wrong to say that the Ukrainians have fully recaptured these positions. What has happened is that advanced parties of Ukrainian troops have been able to break through into them, but the result has been that they have been encircled by the Russians and are in effect trapped there. So if you follow what Radovka has been saying, and as I said, increasingly now, the various mapping and media projects and the Telegram channels are starting to come round to acknowledging that their description of events is correct, though I notice that they seem very reluctant to give Radovka credit for reporting the situation as it almost certainly really is. Anyway, if you follow the information we're getting, you can see why the situation in Pokrovsk is indeed becoming critical, why Zelensky has had to dash to the area to keep the Ukrainian troops still fighting, and why, before doing so, he warned his MPs in Kiev that difficult times on the battlefields might be coming, that the situation is getting from bad to worse, and critical decisions might soon have to be made. Now, as to what those decisions might be, I'm not going to speculate with Zelensky. It is always unwise to. Logically, he ought to now be discussing with the local military commanders how Ukrainian troops who are at risk of becoming trapped in Pokrovsk should be allowed to retreat from there. I say that. I fully acknowledge Pokrovsk's importance. I accept that the fall of Pokrovsk would undermine the entire Ukrainian defense system in Donbass. Very difficult to see how the Ukrainians could hold on to the town of Konstantinovka, for example, which is located to the east of Pokrovsk. Konstantinovka would be certain to fall, and fall fairly quickly, I would have thought, once the Russians have consolidated control of Pokrovsk. In fact, if the Ukrainians were to try to defend Konstantinovka after Pokrovsk had fallen, that would risk creating another cauldron for the Ukrainians in Konstantinovka as well. But knowing Zelensky, he's going to do the opposite. He'll probably demand more counterattacks. He'll demand more reserves be sent to the area. Reserves, who knows where they would come from. There's some reports that the Ukrainians are now transferring troops both from Sumy region and from Kherson region, which are reasonably quiet at the moment, to try to hold their positions in Pokrovsk and other places. In other words, leaving large areas of the front lines ultimately stripped of defenders. But I can't imagine that Zelensky is prepared to give up Pokrovsk. After all, he has already assured not just the American media, but General Kellogg, that Ukraine is winning the war. General Kellogg repeated in that interview that he gave, that I've touched on in previous programs, that because the Russians haven't captured Odessa or Kiev or Zhytomyr or Lvov, that must mean that the Ukrainians are winning. This is now what Zelensky is saying, and the fact that the Russians are only making incremental advances at enormous cost, this also proves that it is the Ukrainians who are winning the war, not the Russians. And General Kellogg was told this by Zelensky, and General Kellogg believes it, and he's passed that on to President Trump. So, of course, you have to hold on to Pokrovsk, you have to hold on to the towns in Donbass, because if you don't, that entire narrative collapses. And of course, if the narrative collapses, well, President Trump might become angry and he might take further action, which might not be beneficial, well, maybe for Ukraine, but definitely for Zelensky himself and the government structure that he heads in Kiev. So for that reason, machines have to continue to be sent into Pokrovsk. More men have to die there. More machines have to be lost there. The disaster has to be made still greater, because it's important to preserve the narrative, the story that is being told to the American media and to Donald Trump, and that is the greatest priority now. Anyway, let's move on. And since I've started on the situation in the battlefronts, it would be remiss of me not to say a bit more about what is going on in other places. It seems, and I'm going to be very brief, that Konstantinovka, the Russians are now clearing the Dacha settlement south of Konstantinovka. They're about to enter that town as well. The situation in Kupiansk has become so critical. It does look as if Ukrainian troops are trapped there. So it seems that Syrskyi has transferred the already badly depleted and exhausted 3rd Azov Brigade. It doesn't call itself that anymore. From the Liman area, he's rushed it to Kupiansk, either to try to break through and to reinforce the Ukrainian defenders in Kupiansk, or perhaps to make it possible to withdraw the Ukrainian defenders from Kupiansk and from the positions they continue to hold pointlessly on the east bank of the Oskol River. It's the old story that Syrskyi has consistently followed ever since he became the military chief in Ukraine. Whenever there is a crisis, in Avdiivka, now previously in Pokrovsk, now in Kupiansk, he turns to the various units of the Azov organization. So you have Azov troops now trying to hold positions northeast of Pokrovsk, trying to push back the Russians there, even as the situation in Pokrovsk deteriorates, and the Azov forces, exhausted and depleted as they are being rushed like the fire brigade unit that they have become. They've been rushed to Kupiansk to try at least to stem the collapse that is now taking place ever more rapidly there. And in the meantime, the situation elsewhere deteriorates. There's more reports today that the Russians control now around a third of the village of Yampol. And of course, Gerasimov said that they're already fighting inside Seversk itself. And there's been more reports that the Russians are continuing their remorseless advance in the Zaporozhye area. Both the forces that are advancing from the east, originally from the town of Velikaya Novosilka that the Russians captured earlier in the winter. They continue to push westwards towards Gulyapolye, towards the roads linking Gulyapolye, supplying Gulyapolye, the Ukrainian defenders in Gulyapolye. They continue to advance remorselessly in that direction. And they also apparently continue their advances in Stepnogorsk and in Primorye, immediately to the south of the great city of Zaporozhye. So this is my brief summary of the situation on the battlefields. There was another massive combined drone and missile strike across Ukraine as well last night. The Ukrainians are apparently now telling the Europeans that it has become impossible to conduct industrial operations on Ukrainian territory. All of the fantasies which we were hearing for years actually about building up Ukraine's military industrial complex on its territory, all of those fantasies are melting away as the Russians, who now clearly have a very well organized intelligence operation in Ukraine, immediately strike at factories as soon as they're about to start production. Notice that we've heard absolutely nothing about Ukrainian missile strikes on Russia. The Sapsan missiles, which apparently were going to be used before the end of July, we haven't seen any of those. The Russians claim that they've destroyed all the industrial facilities which were making them and the warehouses where they were. We've heard nothing about the famous Flamingo missile that the Ukrainians showed us photos of with so much pomp and commentary just a few weeks ago. We've heard nothing about it since. The wave of these big, lumbering cruise missiles that were supposed to reach targets everywhere in Russia. Well, that has still not happened. I'm guessing that the Russians know where most of these missiles are and are now busy striking at the launch positions and the warehouses and the factories. The Russians themselves spoke some short time ago about Taurus missiles being launched from Ukrainian territory. Well, again, that doesn't seem to be happening, at least for the moment. No doubt, at some point within the next few weeks, we will start to see some attempts by the Ukrainians to launch missiles into Russia again. But the overall story continues to be of overwhelming Russian dominance in the sky, Russian drones, Russian missiles pounding Ukraine, and the Ukrainians quietly abandoning, I say very quietly, the Europeans also abandoning the whole project of building up some great military industrial complex on the territory of Ukraine. Anyway, in the meantime, Ursula von der Leyen says that she's going to announce today not the 19th sanctions package exactly, because it has not been agreed, but apparently the framework of the 19th sanctions package. We don't yet know what it's going to include, but apparently it is not going to include major tariffs on China or India or other buyers of Russian oil or anything of that kind. And we also have reports in the United States, a very interesting article, by the way, in the Financial Times on this whole topic, about a new plan for sanctions against Russia in the Senate. Now, over the last couple of months, we've been hearing a huge amount about the bone-crushing sanctions that Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal had put together. These were sanctions which supposedly were going to impose 500% tariffs on buyers of Russian oil, with the countries specifically targeted being India and China. Well, as we know, Donald Trump went along with this idea for a short time. Back in July, he said that he would impose 100% tariffs on countries that bought Russian oil if the Russians didn't agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine within 50 days. And then President Trump announced that he would bring forward that deadline to the 8th of August. And then as the 8th of August deadline approached, he sent Steve Witkoff to Moscow, and instead of the 100% tariffs on India and China, he had a meeting with President Putin in Anchorage in Alaska. And then when the ceasefire still didn't come, and President Trump, of course, now accepts that there can't be a ceasefire, but when the ceasefire didn't come, when the fighting didn't stop, when the negotiated deal didn't appear, when the trilateral summit meeting between Trump, Zelensky and Putin didn't happen, Trump imposed 50% tariffs on India, 25% because of Indian trade practices that President Trump finds objectionable, and 25% tariffs on India because India was continuing to buy Russian oil. And India said that it would continue to buy Russian oil. And Prime Minister Modi went to China and was photographed there with President Putin and with President Xi Jinping, and everything seemed to suggest that India was, as a result of this sanctions pressure, not only refusing to stop buying Russian oil, but tilting further towards Russia and China. And President Trump was upset by this and was upset by the fact that Prime Minister Modi wasn't answering his calls. And then eventually he did speak to Prime Minister Modi, and they had a friendly call on the occasion of Prime Minister Modi's 75th birthday. But what President Trump perhaps wasn't aware of is that on the same day, the Prime Minister Modi spoke and accepted President Trump's congratulations on his 75th birthday. He also took a phone call from President Putin, who also, of course, congratulated Prime Minister Modi on his 75th birthday on the same day. So anyway, then President Trump came and said, well, he would impose these enormous tariffs on India and China and take all of these drastic actions against the Russians to try to bring them to heel, but only if the Europeans did so. And over the last 2 weeks, as I've discussed in many programs now, the Europeans have said that they won't do so, that imposing the kind of tariffs on India and China that President Trump is demanding would be catastrophic for the European economy, to the point where even obsessive political leaders like Macron, Merz, Ursula von der Leyen, and the others, people who want to do everything they possibly can to secure victory for Ukraine in the war, even they balk at doing this thing. So, the latest proposals in the US Senate, put forward by one Republican senator, but apparently also dependent upon President Trump's agreement before they can be put into action. The latest proposal is more sanctions against Russia's shadow fleet. We're back to that again. More sanctions. It's unclear to me what these sanctions are going to be. I don't know whether it's going to be declared, for example, that it is illegal to transport Russian oil on ships. Maybe the European Union is going to try to do the same thing. But it's important to say again that there is nothing shadowy at all about this fleet. There is nothing illegal about transporting Russian oil above the G7 oil price cap, which, by the way, the United States, or so I understand it, is no longer even enforcing. The only thing that makes this whole traffic, this whole maritime industry, if you like, different, is that the ship owners whose ships carry this Russian oil are not taking out their insurance in London. And as I've explained in program after program, they don't have to, because the days of London's monopoly on maritime insurance are far in the past now. Well, who knows what these new sanctions or tariffs or whatever it is on the shadow fleet are going to be, but I'm going to suggest that it is still going to be ineffectual. I still suspect that there will be ship owners prepared to make ships available to be used for this trade. The Russians and others will continue to provide insurance for this trade so long as there are buyers for Russian oil. There will be suppliers, there will be ships that are prepared to trade in it. And that is, again, a reality that the Europeans, the Americans, simply don't seem to be able to acknowledge. We are now in the game of sanctions for the sake of sanctions. The reason we are getting sanctions, these proposals being made now, is obviously they do make life more complicated for people. They make life more difficult for ship owners, for ship captains. I doubt that their crews, frankly, care very much or know much of what is going on around them. But anyway, it does make life a little more complicated for these very tough and hardened and experienced people. But ultimately, the reason that this endless convoy, this rolling circus of sanctions has to keep moving is not because any of these sanctions are going to make the slightest difference. They're not going to change anything that's happening on the battlefields. They're not going to affect the continuing development of the Russian economy in any way at all. But it is important to maintain the appearance of action, to say that sanctions are continuing to be imposed, that the Russians are still being punished for their aggression. It has now become simply another cliche rather than practical action anymore. The Russians will shrug. The Chinese and the Indians will do the same. They will always find ways to get the oil, and the oil will continue to come. But Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Lindsey Graham, all of these people can go out and pretend that something is being done, whereas in fact the reality is that nothing is being done. And that, I'm afraid, also summarizes the state visit by Donald Trump to Britain, which is winding up today. By the time you're watching this program, President Trump will probably be back in the United States. Now, this was an extraordinary visit. No agreements of any substance were signed or agreed. There was an agreement on AI cooperation. The Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, talked it up, as perhaps he was bound to do. President Trump seemed notably less enthusiastic. The idea that Britain has much to offer the United States in this area is fantastic. It is absurd. There is nothing that the British can do in terms of AI that the Americans cannot do also with little effort, and in many cases, I suspect, they have probably already done. That is not, by the way, to knock my own country. The British can do lots of things. They have lots of talented and capable people who could do great things in AI and in other technologies. It's just that the political and governmental and administrative and business structures in Britain don't really support them in those endeavours, and absolutely nothing that has been agreed in this agreement is going to change that in any possible way. Just to say that again. So we've had that agreement, but in all other respects, other than the fact that President Trump has met the King, that he's ridden in a golden carriage, that he's had Prime Minister Starmer and Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper fawn on him, I can't see that anything very much has come of this visit at all. The most interesting fact about this visit for me, incidentally, was that there seems to have been a decision to limit as far as possible, President Trump's visits, attendance in the capital, the nation's capital, in London. All the big events seem to have taken place just outside London. And it's inevitable that the reason for that is because there was a concern, presumably, that if President Trump was to visit London, there would be protests which would inevitably be as much about Prime Minister Starmer as they would be about him. And I noticed that Parliament was not recalled as it could have been and has been on other state visits in order to receive President Trump. There has been no speech, as I thought there might be, in Westminster Hall or anything like that. And again, I can't help but think that one of the reasons that Parliament has not been recalled, even for a day, even for that purpose, is that Prime Minister Starmer now senses that his political position is so precarious that he doesn't want the MPs to come together and meet, because he worries that if they do, what they will mostly do is plot against him. So this has been there. It's the backdrop to President Trump's state visit. And, well, some have suggested that the state visit has brought Prime Minister Starmer a few days of comparative peace, even as his political position crumbles below him. And at a certain level, that is possibly true. But the optics of the state visit have, in my opinion, probably done him more harm. He has been dominated over the course of that visit by Trump, who, of course, inevitably has attracted the media attention. And if you read the British media, as I do every day, particularly those parts of the media which might, in normal circumstances, have been expected to be sympathetic to Keir Starmer and his political positions, well, they are increasingly critical. They are not happy about the state visit. There is, for example, an article in The Guardian which says that the state visit was a mistake, and there is an editorial in The Guardian which is critical of the state visit and of Prime Minister Starmer's conduct of it as well. In my opinion, ultimately, this state visit will have strengthened opposition to Prime Minister Starmer within his own Labour Party. Anyway, there we are. So lots of action, lots of activity on the sanctions front, but no real action. A state visit, again, all activity, and some of it, rather splendid activity, but nonetheless also no real action. And that, it seems to me, is the story that we have across certainly the European part of the collective West today. Prime Minister Le Cornu in Paris has apparently dropped any idea of trying to impose the kind of budget measures that his predecessor, Monsieur Bayrou, was thinking about. He knows perfectly well that the French Parliament won't accept them, and so he's going to continue to let the French government budget balloon, even as France's credit ratings are lowered. His priority now is to keep his friend and boss, Emmanuel Macron, as president for the next year. And, well, if that means that France has no effective government, then so be it. The same is true in Britain. The The same, I would suggest, is also true in Germany now. Friedrich Merz continues to make speeches. They continue to be mostly about foreign policy. I take that back. They're not about foreign policy at all. They are mostly about Russia, about the enormous, terrifying threat that Russia poses against the whole of Europe. He's made more speeches to this effect. This has now become his major talking point, the major meme that he has. Of course, he was elected as the Chancellor who would reform Germany, but instead, what he's going to do is borrow lots and lots of money so that he can spend it on arms, and he's talking about rearming Germany and about how this time a rearmed Germany will not be the threat to Europe, it will be the protector of Europe. He seems oblivious to the fact that another German Chancellor in another period of war, or, well, actual war with Russia, in his various speeches, if you read them, regularly used to say the same thing. I want to stress, I don't myself think that Chancellor and Chancellor Merz have anything else at all in common, but it is strange to me to hear the same theme about the threat from the East being revived all over again, and the same narrative about how the German army, a very, very different army, by the way, from the one that existed at that time, in a very, very different Germany as well, how the German army, again, is going to be the key protector and defender of Europe against this ominous threat from the East. Anyway, I'm not going to spend more time dwelling on Chancellor Merz. It seems to me that in Germany also, before very long, we're going to find ourselves in the same situation of administration having taken the place of government. The only policy now in Europe is to talk up the threat from Russia. In terms of substantive reforms, we see no movement whatsoever. Mario Draghi, who was commissioned by the European Union to do a great report on how to reform Europe's economy and who has delivered it, is complaining about how his recommendations, very bad recommendations in my opinion, are not being heeded. Nobody has a plan in Europe. Nobody, by the way, has a plan about how to win this conflict that we have catapulted ourselves into in Ukraine. I was reading a very interesting post by my friend Ian Proud on his Substack blog, The Peacemonger. He says there about a fairly well-known British politician who has privately and openly admitted to the fact that the sanctions have been a failure, but who also says to Ian Proud that it's not something that one can say in public. I find this particularly disappointing because the politician in question, who is well known to me, is somebody who is often forthright on many issues, but it seems not about that. There is this silence, this pall of silence that has fallen across Europe. We're not allowed to talk or discuss at a political level about these things. We can't chart a different course. We have brave souls like Lord Skidelsky who makes his points in the House of Lords, but we can't confront the major salient issue in Europe today, the crisis with Russia, the emerging debacle in Ukraine, and until and unless we do, I cannot see how any of Europe's other problems can be addressed or consulted. So in the meantime, we get activity everywhere in place of action. Now, in other places, in other parts of the world, it is different. And as a lot of people have commented upon recently, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have now formalized the alliance that has always, in reality, existed between them. And it's been well known for many, many years that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are very close friends, that Saudi Arabia financed, for example, or at least partly financed, Pakistan's nuclear program. There are claims or rumors that the Pakistanis, in return for that Saudi finance, agreed that in a moment of crisis, if Saudi Arabia needed a nuclear umbrella, then Pakistan would provide it, up to and including supposedly providing Saudi Arabia with an actual nuclear device, nuclear weapon. Well, those are the rumors. I'm not saying they are true, because of course the Saudis and the Pakistanis don't tell me, but I suspect they are. And this latest agreement that the Saudis and the Pakistanis have published actually formalizes that relationship. It makes it official. It brings it out into the open. And from what I have understood about this agreement, what we're talking about is an actual military alliance, a genuine defense alliance between these two countries, between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Now, I think that there are a number of things to say about this, and I will do so, though fairly briefly. Firstly, inevitably, a lot of people are speculating that the reason this treaty has been agreed between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, the reason they've come out, if you like, about their relationship, is because of the recent Israeli attack on Qatar. I don't think this can be so. Briefly, this treaty must have been a long time in the works, even if it formalizes a relationship that has already existed. It is impossible that all of the clauses and agreements in the treaty could have been negotiated and agreed, even between two countries that are very friendly with each other over the course of just a few days. This agreement clearly began to be worked on some time ago. And I am going to suggest that the reason the Pakistanis and the Saudis now felt that they could formalize their relationship and make it public in this fashion is because of the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. Pakistan has very good relations with Iran. It has strongly supported Iran in Iran's own conflicts with Israel and the United States, and it did not want to ally itself publicly in this way with Saudi Arabia at a time when Saudi Arabia was in conflict with Pakistan's friend, which was Iran. Then in 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran, through Chinese mediation, and it is important to remember that China is an ally of Pakistan. Anyway, through Chinese mediation, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed a rapprochement. That meant that the concern the Pakistanis had that if they formalized their alliance with Saudi Arabia, that might be seen in Iran as a threatening step. That no longer applies any longer, and the way was therefore opened for the Saudis and the Pakistanis to move forward with this treaty. The Iranians are no longer concerned about it. The relationship between Iran and Pakistan is unaffected, and of course that strengthens the announcement of this relationship, now strengthens Saudi Arabia's position in the Middle East, because it has now the public formal backing of what is the Islamic world's most powerful military state, the one with the largest army and the one that has long-range missiles and nuclear weapons. And this does, of course, affect the US position, because the United States has good relations with Saudi Arabia and has good relations with Pakistan. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are both US allies and friends. So at a certain level, the United States should not be unduly concerned if two of its friends and allies, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, agree this kind of alliance with each other. It cannot, by definition, be hostile or unfriendly towards the United States. But this does have an effect on the situation in the Middle East, because up to now, in the absence of a formal agreement with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia has relied on the United States to be its protector. This has been so ever since a meeting that took place in 1945 in the run-up to the Allied conference in Yalta between President Roosevelt of the United States and the then King of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud. And ever since that time, Saudi Arabia has relied and depended on the United States for protection. And the fact that the Saudis now have another alternative protector in the form of Pakistan obviously makes the military relationship with the United States, the security relationship, less important. I said that this agreement, this military agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, was probably not caused by the Israeli attack on Qatar, but the timing of its announcement might have been. It's undoubtedly the case that the Gulf states have been alarmed by the fact that one of them has now been attacked by Israel, with the United States apparently unable to restrain the Israelis, perhaps even having worked with the Israelis. There are those rumors to conduct this attack. That is alarming for the Gulf states, which have always up to now seen themselves as America's allies. And, well, given that that is so, the Saudis now have a good reason, and the other Gulf states have a good reason for obtaining other friends. And, of course, it's important to say that behind Pakistan is Pakistan's great ally, which is, of course, China. So China already supplies weapons to Saudi Arabia. It already supplies Saudi Arabia with ballistic missiles. Saudi Arabia and China are likely to want to deepen this relationship, given that they're now both military allies of one and the same country, which is, of course, Pakistan. So the ultimate result of this treaty between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan is that it is going to strengthen Chinese influence in the Arab world. Now, there is another country, or another two countries, that will be watching this development with interest, and those are India and Russia. India historically has bought oil from Iran, which, as we see, has now good relations with both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and which has been leaning on Pakistan during its own confrontations with Israel and the United States. India has in the past bought oil from the other Gulf states, from Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is now a military ally of Pakistan, India's perennial rival, and some would say enemy. So the Indians must be saying to themselves, well, in an all-out confrontation with Pakistan, which of course we don't want to see, but which might nonetheless arise, oil supplies from the Gulf might not be so reliable, because the Gulf producers, all of them, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the others, are more friends now with Pakistan rather than us. So to whom, therefore, do we look for our oil? The Americans offer oil, but probably they can't offer that much because they consume most of what they produce, and their oil is expensive. So where do we go? To whom do we go for our oil? To that country that has always stood by us through every problem, through every crisis, that stood by us through thick and thin, the country that is predictable, that is friendly, that is reliable, whose president is visiting our country in December. Of course, Russia. So this rapprochement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia is likely to strengthen the connection between Russia and India as well. I am sure that the Indians have known about the discussions around this agreement for some time. China will certainly have been aware of it, and information about it will have circulated amongst the BRICS. It is another reason why India will want to hold on to its relationship with Russia, as closely as it does. So this is an important agreement. To repeat again, it is not an agreement hostile to the United States. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are historic friends and allies of the United States. But the overall effect is to reduce America's importance in the Middle East. It inevitably signals an increase in Chinese influence in the Middle East. And one of its consequences is likely to be a further strengthening of the friendship and, by the way, de facto alliance between India and Russia. So, inaction, in fact, paralysis in Europe, but we see that elsewhere in the world, action does take place. Nations, great nations, maneuver and make plays with each other, they strengthen their relations, they develop their relations further, they make agreements that ensure their interests and their security. They, in other words, conduct foreign policy and diplomacy, something which in Europe we are no longer able to do. Well, this is where I'm going to finish my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You could support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.